So we thought we'd start our discussion today talking about one of the kind of most irksome issues about left-hand technique, which is legatos, sometimes called slurs. And in the English-speaking world, they're often using terms such as hammer-ons and pull-offs, which I find are not particularly helpful. But it would be interesting to kind of talk about some of the issues that happen with slurs or legatos, how they're used, why they're used. Sometimes, of course, it's for phrasing, sometimes, of course, it's for technical ease, but actually it'd be really interesting to talk about how the mechanics of it, but also what we're listening for and how we can use our ears to improve the quality of our legatos.
Yeah, so something that we encounter a lot is students trying to do legatos, and because they've referred to them as hammer-ons and pull-offs, that informs the way they're going to go about it. So maybe I'll just grab the guitar right away and talk about this. So many of you watching this will probably know this, but it's always useful just as a reminder, is for instance, pull off, just make sure you want to do that, like out the way, and it's not very clear sound or controlled, whereas it should really be called a pull down, because essentially what you want to do with the left hand is you're going to pluck the string with your left hand finger. It's like doing a rest stroke on your left hand. So interestingly, we both shared a teacher, Philip Thorne, and when I was a teenager I had to play in a master class, I think, and Phil was there, and he spoke to me and he said, "Oh, that was really nice, blah 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 blah, but you can't do pull-offs right." And I was like, "Oh," and I was kind of pleased because I was like, my pull-offs didn't really sound like what I heard on CDs at the time. And he said, "Try this," and he just got me to do a rest stroke with the left hand finger. Well, it doesn't matter what finger, and that really helped me get the idea of what my fingers should be doing.
It's essentially a left-hand pluck, isn't it?
Yeah, that's all it is. It's just a left-hand rest stroke. But the interesting thing is you can really match, so you might pluck hard and then you can pull hard to match the sound. But the thing is, slurs are sometimes used as like to create an appoggiatura, which is like strong to weak. So you don't want the pull to be strong. So it depends what you're doing. But in a nutshell, you need to be pulling down and not pulling off. Otherwise, you've not got much control, and the sound is quite poor in terms of quality.
There's got to be an element of lift as well as the pull, though, isn't there? So it's not entirely kind of pull down.
Yeah.
Sometimes it kind of depends. You've got to use your ears, I think, kind of most of the time, because sometimes when you're performing, you can hear people use quite heavy pull-offs or like that type of legato, where it almost feels kind of slightly sort of technically based, but it's kind of interesting because you're saying it does often function as an appoggiatura, and it functions from a phrasing point of view rather than from a technical point of view. How do you go about preparing your fingers for, say, a pull-off legato?
So if it's a two-finger one, meaning, say you're on, I'll just stick with what I was doing, I was in fret 8 and fret 7 with my fourth finger and my third finger. I would put them on together because it's quite dangerous to try and pull off and put that on just in time. You can do it, as you can see, but it's not the best idea. So you put them on together, and say you're doing an exercise where you're going to be doing 8 to 7 pull off. This is us in 5th position, so the pinky's covering fret 8 and the third finger's on all the 7s. You're going to pull off and then you set them together. So if you can break down the actions, you're going to pull, I was saying off, but I'll say down, pull down, and then the third finger comes up a little bit and then they go down together, and you just continue that.
Now, are you pressing with both fingers at the start, or you're pressing with one finger and the other finger is touching?
I'm pushing with both, but then when I get to this point, I'm relaxing the third and it's coming there, and then actually relax them both to reset it. Because if I was to pull down and then come up and then trying just to add that in, my hand gets in an unbalanced position. So that's actually a really good thing you asked that, because I'll do it without doing it the correct way and you'll see what happens. So I'm going to pull off and then I'm there, and right away I'm pulling here and my hands went flat. So for me, and I'm sure a lot of other people, you need the reset. So pulling down and then a reset, and I'm doing that every single time.
And is that the same pattern that you would use for all combinations of fingers? Because, for example, some performers like to have both 3 and 4 down as a unit, because 3 and 4 act slightly differently in terms of the digits in our hand. But with, say, if they were doing a 3-2 pull off, they might have 3 and 2 on the string, but only 3 pressing, but 2 touching until the last minute, and actually then transferring the energy between the 2 fingers.
Well, for initially I'm putting them both on together, but the transfer of energy is another thing, slightly more advanced thing to do if you're just getting into pull-offs for the first time, because you'll find if you're just doing pull-offs for the first time, and you'll notice I'm doing everything from the pinky, because that was a habit I established when I was younger, because it's the weakest side of your hand. So whenever you're starting exercises for Ligado or whatever, you could always start with the pinky, because we might give it a wee bit more effort. It's not the nicest thing to say, but sometimes by the time we get to the end of an exercise, if we're starting on the index and we get to pinky, we might not do so many pinky repetitions.
Sora said the same thing in his methods, didn't he? He sort of felt that, like, actually that you needed to address the balance issues that exist in our hands. So part of that way of redressing the balance was to actually start a lot of the exercises and start a lot of the choreography in your left hand from the pinky side.
Yeah, so, but the transfer of energy is an interesting point, because if you pull off and you keep your hand really still and it's just all the finger, it works, but it's difficult to repeat that many times like this. You start to feel your shoulder burning, your pinky burning, but if you can incorporate a wee bit of movement into your arm, you can do it for a long time, and you can, I don't know if you can perceive that through the microphone, but the tone of the pull-off softens.
So talk to everyone who's watching. When you were doing that, it does actually improve the tone a lot, but are you having some kind of sense of relaxation in the wrist and the elbow and the shoulder? What's moving? Because I could see that your shoulder and your elbow was moving, but where are you directing the movement from?
I'm thinking of, I'm going from the right to left, so that's as you're looking at your own hand. So I'm bringing my hand out, and as a consequence of that, my elbow and my whole forearm's going out to the left. It's changing the angle of the pull-off as well, because if you go straight down, that's very bright sounding. But when you get to, if you can move the hand over a little bit, it's going to change the angle to make it much, just a nicer sound. And that was something I didn't like about pull-offs when I was studying, was I felt like I had to stay rigid and my tone would be quite warm, and then I would do a pull-off and it didn't fit. I was like, that's dead bright, I don't like that. And I wasn't sure how to combat that. But then one day, I don't know when, I was doing it, and I was just moved the arm, and I was like, that sounds better. But it was going against a lot of things I'd been told in terms of how to do a pull-off, or maybe had read. So
the method books make it really dry. But
yeah.
Did you say that you'd seen a concert by Stefan Rack where he talked a lot about the transfers of energy?
It wasn't Stefan Rack, it was Pavel Steidl, but of course Stefan Rack taught Pavel Steidl, I'm pretty sure. So yeah, Pavel Steidl came and done a lot of masterclasses with us in Scotland, and this was something he spoke about. If you've met him before at festivals, you probably resonate with a lot of what I'm saying, because he's told you already. It was all about this moving.
But then explain to people who haven't seen it, because I wasn't in the room.
So he would say about, if he saw someone, for instance, so with a still hand, he would say, no, move like this. Because if you see Pavel playing, he'll do things when he's very virtuosic and he's doing chromatic Ligados and all sorts of things, but you'll see his hands moving up and down, his arms coming out. And that's how he's able to do it so well, because he's using a bigger part of his body, and the tone's nice as well.
So you're saying that the kind of the legatos, the slurs are more of a gesture.
Yeah.
So when he's directing the movement, is the direction coming from the fingers or from the wrist or from the forearm, the elbow, the shoulder? Where is this starting from?
I think when I'm doing it, he didn't quite tell us that, but I'm thinking it is almost like being a dancer or something. I'm thinking of this finger and these are falling over, and it is a gesture whole thing. I'm not so much thinking about I need to move my elbow and my arm, because for me that might make me do it. Yeah, make it more mechanical.
So you're feeling it with the fingers, and then you're allowing the other parts of your arm to follow.
Yeah, basically. So it's more about the fingers. I'm not thinking about I'm going to bring my elbow out and it's going to come in, because again that's going to make it not very fluid. But really, when I'm doing things like this, I'm listening to the sound. See, there isn't no movement. It's subtle, but there's something different there, and I prefer the one with the movement.
What happens if you are also doing the same motion, and then you have the direction, but you also are emptying the fingers at the same time? Like, are you feeling anything sort of remaining in the first, second, and third finger once you've reached the fourth finger?
It's more weight towards the pinky, but they're still on. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So but whereas in the traditional way, where you might keep the hand still, that feels like they're sort of even in energy. Which gives a different sound and feel, but it's certainly, if you could imagine the energy was visible in terms of light, the pinky would have a stronger light and it'd be dimming slightly as you go back.
Because there are some people who make the argument that when you have a motion like that you're actually kind of just almost emptying the fingers that are no longer being needed, so that it's all going to this note, and it does sort of affect the sound. But then other people might feel that they don't like to not have contact with the string with the other fingers, especially if they then were going to come to it in another space. Also, sometimes I suppose if you kind of exposed quite a bit in that sense, if you then are fearful of touching the other strings to make kind of any sound at the same time. But it's interesting because it is about this transference of energy. And could you then show what it would be like in reverse?
Yeah, so the other way is just stay really still, but so you can hear that, but I'm not quite being really strict about, because we get taught you must pull down and rest there like that, which is fine, but again I don't think that sounds very nice. It's very Ponticello, because I guess if you think of the distance between this finger and what's been pulled off, it's getting closer, so it's like when you play near a high fret, there's this, you've basically got a short string over you're plucking, so it's very bright. But what I was getting at there is that I'm not being pedantic about resting on the string below, because if I did that and I'm turning my hand, it's actually not that easy and it's unnecessary. So you can kind of break the rules, I think, if you think the sound is better, because that's what it's all about. It's music and we want to create the sound we want. So I think if you manipulate technique for an artistic reason, that's good, but if you're manipulating it unconsciously, I'm basically not doing it correct, that's not good. So you need to be able to sort of qualify your decision to not do the sort of classic way of a particular technique, in my opinion.
Also, I think that sometimes when you see people performing, they're often confused as to whether or not a slur or a legato is being used for technical or musical purposes. And if it is for a technical purpose, is it that you essentially want to have two even notes, but for the right hand or for the left hand, it actually makes it easier to play with a slur? And then if it's a musical decision that's following the phrasing of the piece, how do you kind of approach that? And sometimes I feel that a lot of performers just throw slurs in because it might make a passage easier, but without any kind of thought as to what that does to the musical elements of the piece. And I think there's not much kind of discussion about how you use slurs properly. And then as well, if you kind of look, say, at the music from the 19th century, there's got to be kind of a sort of a lightness and an effervescence that you can kind of achieve through the proper use of very relaxed slurs, just the type of slurs that you were demonstrating there. And that if you kind of have the slurs or the legatos be too heavy, the piece doesn't speak in the same way. It becomes sort of far too heavy, and then it can sound pompous rather than charming and light. And so I think that like there's an element as well that is not frequently discussed, but how legatos might be used in different periods and different genres. Because sometimes you might have a sort of a specific passage, say in a piece by Brouwer, where it almost, the passage might call for more of a rest stroke slur, where you're letting your fingers come to rest on the adjacent string, and that the slurs might form in that instance a percussive effect, whereas other times you almost don't want to hear that it's a slur at all, and you want it to sort of sound just like incredibly light notes that are being plucked by the left hand rather than the right hand, and so that it almost can have a lightness that you wouldn't be able to achieve with individually plucked notes. And so I think there's not much discussion about how slurs are used in different contexts, but also in different genres, but also even within different composers, because we're lucky certain composers who might be guitarists themselves, we might have some inkling as to how they wanted to use legatos. Barrios is an example of that. But other composers, we can have some indications maybe by some of their phrasing, but otherwise we are kind of left to our own choices in terms of how to use it. Something as well that I find is also often neglected in terms of sort of say 19th century performers, 19th century composers and before, is the use of strings, because we're using nylon strings now, and it's nylon with a steel coating and things. And that would have felt very different to how composers in the 19th century would have been, even until really the 1950s, in terms of gut strings. And that, if you really plucked too hard, you just break the string. I mean, it was sort of common, I think, in early Segovia concerts for him to change 2 or 3 strings within a concert. So I think actually some of the sort of more aggressive, sort of macho slurs that you can sort of see now would not have been possible at that time, because you just would have broken the string. And I think it does inform how you then perform certain pieces.
Yeah. I think maybe you could, in a concise way of how you would think about slurs, is not just doing a slur because it's there, is thinking about what's the function of this slur, and the notes that are involved part of the harmony. Is the harmony note that's involved tense or not? Is it resolving? All these things would inform how you would play them, and it's basically doing the slurs in a way that you're not just doing a slur because it's easy. I think Bream was famous for, he wanted to achieve the sound he could hear in his head, and he would go about that in any way he had to, and not be like, oh, I would like it to be like this, but it's too hard, so I'm not going to bother. He would do some crazy things just to achieve that sound that he wanted. So
in a way, it's almost as though he could play them as individual notes and phrase them how he wanted, and then try to match that sound with the legatos put in. Was that what you were saying? Or
I was just saying that instead of just doing a legato for this, because it's there, you should question it and be like, why is there a legato there? Did the person that did the addition think that was best? But that's their decision. And if you watched lots of professional players, you'll see that a lot of the slurs are different. Some take them all out, some put more in, but it's part of what they're trying to convey in their interpretation. So,
well, I think certain pieces have been really affected actually by the editor's use of both the fingering in the left hand and the right hand, but also the sort of sloppy or sometimes arrogant kind of use of slurs within the printed copies, and so some of the kind of music that was sort of published that was composed for Segovia is a good example of it, where sometimes you feel as though it doesn't even actually bear too much resemblance to Segovia's own score copies. Yeah. So sometimes you sort of feel like it's tricky when if I see a piece and I've never played it before, there's nothing better than a completely clean score, because it actually gives you some leeway into how you interpret it. And if I see a score that has all sorts of legato markings and left hand fingerings, it's a bit frustrating, because it immediately you are seeing the piece in that light. But it's not really the same as sort of seeing a Bach score where he might have indicated some of the phrase markings at the beginning of the piece. I feel like some of the guitar editions that are out there are overly fingered, and they don't allow the performer's sort of interpretation to come through particularly naturally.
Yeah, touching on Bach there, if you speak to lute players, again what I said earlier about the function of legato can be to achieve an appoggiatura, and that's what the lute players will do within Bach a lot, is when there is an appoggiatura they will use a slur because it's a natural one. So you play, say, the second note's always going to be less. And of course you can make them as close to each other as you want for another piece, but within Bach that makes sense, and that is an example of using a legato for a musical purpose with good thought behind it. Bach is obviously a minefield, and everyone's going to say something contrary and not agree a lot about all these various things. But it's interesting, you listen to lute players like Paul Odette, for instance. If you search up some of his talks on YouTube, you'll hear him saying about the use of legato, and he'll talk about guitarists, and I think there's videos of him teaching guitarists which you'd find really useful, but he's thinking from a lute player's perspective, which is maybe a wee bit, well, it is closer to the guitar, because the guitar wasn't around then. I
think it does inform how you use slurs, definitely in terms of instrumentation, and I think that there can be all sorts of arguments as to how performers have interpreted legatos over the centuries. But I think that definitely everyone who's using them should really be thinking about whether or not a legato or a slur is improving the performance. So, I mean, maybe you could give an example. If you were to play an appoggiatura with two plucked notes, and then the same appoggiatura, same two notes, with a legato, how would you maybe interpret them differently?
Yeah, so let's just take the same notes, the G to F sharp, and if I was just going, that's with plucked. So I'm making the second one slightly quieter. But if I do it with a legato, it's just got a different quality. For me, that's a lot better, because it kind of keeps this floatiness, because it's still plucked though, because the left hand's plucking it, but there's something more severe about, percussive about the right hand. And then if the left hand's doing it, it's sort of more ghost-like or something.
An airiness to it.
Which.
And then likewise, if you were to do the same two notes, but this time plucked first and then with a hammer on, how would you phrase that as if it was an appoggiatura?
So again, I think for me the legato wins hands down. But again, it would depend on the piece, because maybe it's not Baroque music, maybe it's modern, and it's got some thematic element that doesn't make sense. Mm-hmm. So it all depends on the period, what you're going for. But I think, without going into that, it's another topic, but thinking about whatever piece you're doing, what's the story, what is the point of how you would play it. I think that everything should be informed, and not kind of, this is just what you do, you put your fingers here and get through it.
And using your ears,
mm-hmm.
determining everything by how it sounds. It seems pretty cliched, and I've had it said to me a million times, and actually I do think it is the case that, obviously the hands are working, the fingers all have to be very accurately programmed, but you really must practice at all times with your ears, and you have to be listening and always striving for the next stage. So for example, if you are playing kind of a hammer on, really think to yourself, do you want it to be two even notes? Is it an appoggiatura where the second note is meant to be softer? If so, how would it be used? Is it sort of an ornamentation, or is it kind of integral to the melody? And using your ears to inform how you perform and kind of really perfect everything that you're doing, so that actually you're using legatos to kind of provide to enhance your performance, rather than as a sort of a way of making things easier.
Yeah, and going back to Pavel Steidl, who I was really fortunate to meet several times, I didn't actually hear him say this in a time I was with him. I think it was a YouTube video. He was saying that he was practicing things, and he would have an intuitive feeling like this is what it needs to be, but he was kind of similar to myself with the legatos, that you're kind of taught, do it like this, dead uniform, hands very still. And then I wanted to move, but I was kind of like, oh, you're not meant to do that. But as I got older, I was like, well, you change a little bit in your mindset, and I'm like, I'm going to do what I think sounds best. But getting back to Pavel, he had these feelings about how things should be interpreted in general, or certain techniques, and then he went and studied and he read books and things, and he just confirmed his own intuition, which was nice. But he was basically saying, follow how you feel. If it sounds good, it's good. And sometimes you don't always need to qualify everything. It's like, does it sound good? That's fine. Yeah.
And movement's got to be an element of all of our playing, and I certainly know that people who follow Dalcroze and things like that will sort of say that's essential. I mean, you cannot have kind of like a piece and not understand the kind of macro, micro movements that are involved with it. And sometimes you will see very kind of impressive players, younger players often kind of playing, and it's all very kind of accurate, but you kind of think to yourself, I'm not sure how long that player is going to be playing, because there seem to be kind of tension issues there, and if you're not kind of allowing the kind of freedom of motion, it won't allow you to have a very emotive performance. I think that motion that's essential.
Yeah, because you can demonstrate it to yourself. So you could grab your guitar and take something that you have been working on, anything. But for this demonstration, maybe I'll just play a couple of chords or something like that. So maybe like. So if I play that and I stay really still, it sounds fine. But if I start to move, so without even thinking about it, I started putting in dynamics there, and there was push and pull in the tempo, and it was so different because I wasn't stiff, and I kind of get sucked into it. This guitar is a wee bit out of tune, maybe you noticed, but even then I was still able to connect with it. And that's something when I'm performing sometimes, if I'm like disconnecting from the music, I start to think, oh, I'm not moving. I might be staying perfectly still, but then I can't connect. So it's like having this full, your body's, it's one big thing, really helps. But you could even say that's such a simple progression, wasn't I just making that up? But you could really hear the difference. So if you're stiff, you're going to sound like you're stiff, the music's going to come out, and if you're loose and you're feeling good, you're connecting. And there's another point that obviously a lot of people, when we're playing, our mind could be thinking about the next mistake we don't want to make, and of course you just make it then. But if you're moving, it takes up quite a bit of your consciousness that your mind can't be that busy, because your fingers are going, you're playing the music, you're hearing it, and you're now moving your body. So it can really help your mind from not being too restless, which then you're going to just make a mistake when you're thinking about it. It's inevitable.
I thought it was interesting as well what you were talking about with this idea in terms of the transference of energy, in terms of, if kind of fingers are moving, that maybe there's kind of a different percentage of light source or warmth. Some people kind of like have this idea that when they're kind of performing that they might be feeling like it's sort of a binary thing, so that that you've kind of, once this finger's no longer used, it's kind of it empties, whereas other people might kind of feel like it's kind of this constantly sort of shifting warmth, and so you're kind of like, if you feel that you're tactilely aware, if that's a word, you're aware of the tactile nature of the fingers and this sort of the motion that happens, that also can be kind of a nice thing. When it happens rarely. If I'm playing, it's a really nice feeling, because it feels that you just almost completely connected with the music in a way that you would not be normally. And so obviously we're kind of reflecting on the left hand at the moment, but the same goes for the right hand as well. But I think that there's a certain unique kind of connection with the sound that you can kind of have with the left hand. I think it's really important to kind of maintain that, and I think that legados are an essential part of playing, and they're often ones that people are quite fearful of, or kind of just use without thinking. And I think that if we can all kind of just ponder on them sometimes, I think that they can be really useful. And remember as well that when you're looking at an edition, that might have lots of legatos marked in or none at all. Feel free, if it's within the context of the piece and the style, to change them. So I mean, sometimes you'll see a student playing a piece and they'll kind of sort of say, well, it's marked in here, and you think, well, that's really nice that it's marked in there from 1950 by a composer or a guitarist that maybe had never met the composer. But that doesn't mean that you need to keep it. Whereas other times, if you sort of say, I don't know, the Walton Bagatelles, you think, well, yes, Walton worked really closely with Bream. He knew exactly what he wanted, and they had a very long, close friendship and discussion about the pieces themselves. So yes, I would say that probably those legatos definitely in the Faber edition you would do. But if it's sort of an edition by Alberto Company or something like that, then I might sort of say maybe not. Yeah. But I think that there should be some openness to changing them, and if you feel that you would like to add a slur and you can sort of make a musical reason for it, then I think you should feel free to use it. And if you feel that there's a slur there that's just not working for you, and you might find that it works better if you have it as two plucked notes. Yeah. So it doesn't need to be, if it's on the page, it doesn't mean that it can never evolve or change.
Yeah, just follow. If it sounds good, it's good. And depending where you're at on your journey with the classical guitar, maybe you're with your teacher a lot, and hopefully as you grow, the input from your teacher should lessen, because you don't want to have a teacher forever. Obviously if you start your guitar journey when you're older, that's different, right? But if you are quite young, then you want to be self-sufficient, so you want to try and make your own decisions about colour and dynamics. These are things we'll go into another time, but it's trying to, if your teacher's telling you do this, do that, it's like, well, how can I make those decisions myself? And you're only going to get good at doing them by doing them, basically. If someone's going to just tell you what to do all the time, then you'll just kind of switch off and go, okay, and then it's not really you, because everyone's got a unique approach. But that's slightly going off topic.
But I'd say the best teachers I found are the ones that actually do encourage you to think for yourself. And also who encourage you to experiment and explore. So sometimes, if you're playing a passage, I mean, it can be a useful way of kind of determining something like when to use a legato or not, is to, I would say, take a passage, maybe take all the legatos out if it's causing you some challenge, and then kind of play them as the notes are written, and then kind of add the legatos in, the slurs in, and then record yourself, because sometimes it's difficult to kind of hear it when you are so involved in the actual technique of itself, and sometimes just even on a phone, iPad or something like that, just listen to it and then kind of listen back to it critically and sort of see where is it working and where is it not, and how can it be improved. And I think that sometimes as well it is the case that certain slurs can be removed, and it's also the case that sometimes a slur can come in extremely useful.
Yeah, and if you happen to know a composer, maybe you're studying the guitar somewhere, or you just have a friend that's a composer, if you ask them about slurs and things like that, or they've composed a piece, they're quite nonchalant and go, oh, we'll just take that out, or we'll just rub that note out, and they're not so precious about the individual notes, it's more about the gesture. Whereas I was saying to Adam earlier that when I was younger, I really had a thing about sticking to what was on the page, because I felt like I was doing something right, and if I just wanted to do that. I wasn't really thinking artistically at that point. Whereas if I knew like a composer would come, I'll happily rub a slur or two off, or change a whole bar without a bat of an eyelid, I would have had a different opinion, or not a different opinion, a different way of doing things back then.
That's definitely the case, and I think that there's certain composers, like maybe Britten, who was kind of like very, very fastidious about everything had to be as he wrote it, and other composers that sort of saw it as kind of that might be the element of where the performer comes in, because otherwise if a composer kind of notates everything so precisely without any kind of element for, or any maneuver for personal interpretation, then you start to think, well, what's the point in having a live human do it at all? You could just put it on a MIDI file. And I think that like slurs are a really kind of interesting part of guitar technique, we're sort of very lucky in that sense, because obviously other string instruments have it, but other string instruments don't have the harmonic possibilities the guitar does. So in a way, it's like having the harmonic possibilities of the piano, but on a stringed instrument. And so it is very unique to be able to kind of offer that with this idea of having kind of legatos, and how to use those as a way of augmenting your expressive capabilities.
Yeah.